Euphoria may very well be the most perplexing show I've ever seen. I generally find myself struggling to buy into it, but every now and then an episode will convince me that it's actually good. And not just good in the sense that it was able to produce a good episode, but said episode will convince me that the whole show was actually good all along. And then the next week it'll revert to its old self, and I'll have no idea what I was huffing the week before. The thing is, it's just a show I'm unable to meet on its own terms. I can appreciate it as a collection of technically accomplished music videos, essentially, but whatever relationships and character arcs it wants me to invest myself in are impossible. And I think this is a consequence of what Euphoria demonstrates about a tourism gone sour. Sam Levinson is drunk with power to a degree I don't think we've seen before on TV, aside from maybe Ryan Murphy. It's not unprecedented at this point for a show to give a single person the keys to the kingdom to write and direct every episode on their own after a successful first season. But the examples I'm thinking of have all demonstrated at least a competent adherence to convention, which can't exactly be said of Euphoria's first season. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not going to knock a show on principle for defying convention, and I'd even go so far as to say that Euphoria's greatest moments of cinematic triumph are the direct result of this rebellion. But the aspects that ultimately sink the show are a reminder of why those conventions have etched themselves into common practice in the first place, and make a good case for why Levinson needs a writer's room to reel him in. I think what Levinson demonstrated with Malcolm and Marie, which has sort of informed the direction Euphoria has gone in, is that he often relies on very dense dialogue to convey his ideas. But when I say dense, I don't mean there's a lot to unpack within what the characters are saying. I mean dense like a loaf of bread he didn't let rise. He is just hacking his way through concepts in these drawn-out conversations to the point where it almost feels self-congratulatory that he's maintained a dialogue scene for as long as he has. This is of course most prevalent in the inter-season specials of Euphoria, but a lot of conflict in the main show is resolved by just explicitly pounding away at these topics, be it Ali lecturing Rue, or any of the characters proclaiming in surreal monologue how they're feeling at a given point. And as I use words like dialogue or conversation, it occurs to me that so much of his dialogue is about conjuring up dialogues or conversations, as in the conversation around blank, hot topics that are alluded to as though these characters are deconstructing them or exploring the nuances of them, when in reality they're just clunkily dancing circles around them and suggesting discourse. You get the sense that rather than putting in the legwork to achieve catharsis, he's attempting to reach it through brute force. This approach to dialogue is sort of emblematic of Levinson's entire framework with the show. It's all attained through brute force. The subject matter is certainly abrasive, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be written with more finesse. Addiction, which is the main through line here, is didactically discussed all the time, but its symptoms only come through in the story and Rue's character when it's convenient. She shows little to no symptoms, aside from acting a little goofy when she's high, and then in one episode she's suddenly sick with withdrawals and pushed to the brink of breaking into houses and running into traffic, going off the deep end, and giving Levinson the ability to say he's depicted the horrors of addiction because he's devoted an entire episode to it. I'm no authority on addiction, and I certainly don't want to discredit Levinson's lived experience, but just structurally, this reads as brute fucking force. And the conversations about addiction don't do much for the show at this point either. Talking about something doesn't mean you're necessarily developing the idea of it anymore, and remaining so explicit and abstract about these topics causes Levinson's development to plateau pretty quickly. Euphoria's signature music video-esque sequences attempt to capture the headspace of addiction, or love, or whatever else it's conveying at the time, which seems in a sense to reject the notion of cerebral or intellectual development in favor of capturing those ineffable, amorphous emotions, which I can get down with, but he tries to have it both ways, and that verbosity really weighs things down. I think the biggest offense of brute force is the show's approach to characterization, those 10-minute sequences at the start of each episode that serve to dictate each character's backstory, which I've taken issue with from the start. The concept here comes from a place of empathy, pushing the idea that everyone has stuff going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, and it's not necessarily a problem that those things aren't engaged with in the text of the present-day story, but they don't even inform subtext. They are presented, and they disappear from the show, and Levinson seems to think his work here is done fleshing out these characters when character comes from action and behavior rather than sheer factual, biographical information. Actually, that's not entirely fair. It's not like the characters in Euphoria are lacking in actions and behaviors. That's one of the strongest things the show has going for it. But these sequences suggest a lack of confidence on Levinson's part in those things, so he just front-loads the characters with dense info dumps, and the actions and behaviors that actually are present almost never have any real relationship to the information conveyed in the backstories. I think Cal is like the only character it actually plays a part in, aside from, I guess, the obvious of Rue. And it's yet another thing that in theory interests me. There's Kulishavian potential and character context informing later scenes that don't explicitly reference that context, but it's not tapped into in any sort of compelling way here. I've sort of been under the impression that I was in the minority about these things, but I think the season 2 finale's missteps have begun to show people the light a little bit. Look at how the last 2 episodes, a quarter of the season, are pretty much entirely devoted to Fez, Lexi, and Cassie. So when Rue, the main character of the show, obligatorily has to resolve her threads to make it seem like a chapter is actually closed here, Levinson again chickens out of any real character legwork and opts to revisit the same heavy speech we've seen multiple times already, present didactic monologues about how Rue is feeling at face value, and digress into an actual music video for a couple minutes. I think he was going for something acoustic here, literally an acoustic song, but also something visually acoustic compared to the amped up visuals the rest of the show relies on, to convey Rue's sobriety. But without the show's signature visual and editorial flair, it becomes alarmingly clear how vapid moments like this actually are when there hasn't been sufficient character work in their conflict to make the resolution feel earned. And as a result, Dominic Fike gets memed to death. I'm so torn on season 2 in general, though. There's a sentiment out there that it betrays the grounded character work and focused narrative of season 1, but I would argue that the first season is neither grounded nor focused. I think this show has always been a messy spectacle of heightened reality, and I think doubling down on that is exactly what needed to be done. If it actually tried to serve as a manual for grounded ailments, it would find itself in the same predicament 13 Reasons Why found itself in, giving into sensationalism that ultimately undermines its PSA approach. Euphoria is at least smart enough to be pure, unadulterated sensationalism. It of course alludes to those quote-unquote important dialogues and conversations I mentioned, but it doesn't have the instructional, cautionary quality of 13 Reasons Why. I also find it so funny that 13 Reasons Why is far from a PG show, and it strives for cinematic moments, but Euphoria has so much more sex and crime and drugs and profanity, and uses so much more sophisticated lighting and editorial techniques, it makes that show look like Cobra Kai. That said, Euphoria may be well-shot pulp, but it can't always be enjoyed as pulp. The way I've always sort of described it in my head is that the show puts the most active filmmaking in service of the most passive storytelling. Rue will tell us in a couple sentences of voiceover what a character has been up to for the past couple weeks, and then we'll get 5 to 10 minutes of those characters brooding around in some rooms getting flooded with Blade Runner 2049 lighting. In an hour-long episode, only a handful of things actually happen. I imagine the writing process is more a series of mood boards than actual teleplay material. This, I suppose, challenges the difference between filmmaking and storytelling. Is it good filmmaking if it's not propelling a story well? Is concrete narrative even a useful metric? The answer to these questions is, of course, not necessarily. But TV specifically tends to rely on plot more than film, so as to stay tethered to something and not get lost in the ether over hours and hours of material. This is why it's popularly considered a writer's medium, and why directors are so often mere placeholders in a show's production. So I respect and admire that Euphoria tries to break this notion, being more a showcase of direction than writing. Film is a visual medium and blah blah blah, so I get what they're trying to do here. But it swings so far in the opposite direction that the visuals aren't really in service of anything. The word medium denotes that something is being transferred. Visual medium implies that something is being transferred by visual means. But with Euphoria, I often feel like the only thing being delivered is the visuals themselves. And you know what? Sometimes that's enough. Coupled with the outrageous reality-out-the-window antics of Season 2 and a gazillion dollars on its side, the show hits sometimes. It really does. I mean, say what you will, but it really has established its own language of aesthetics, makeup and wardrobe, a specific brand of brain-dead teens elevated by the fact that they all look 30 years old. They're just fucking boneheads. Nate with his little road beer is the exact kind of stupid bullshit I tune in for. And while we're talking about the road beer, I should say that to the show's credit, Even though these segmented sequences aren't always moving the story along, there is often well-executed, self-contained tension in the filmmaking. That almost makes it harder to watch because you're begging the show to put its technically impressive tools to use on something worthwhile, and it so often doesn't. I think the real liabilities with the show, though, are its self-importance, and of course the inconsistencies with the writing, which I promise I'll get into in a minute. Ever since that Family Guy Godfather clip, it's kind of impossible to use the phrase, "it insists upon itself" about a piece of art, but I'll be damned if Euphoria doesn't insist upon itself. And maybe the vapidness of the show would sit better with me if these sequences weren't bludgeoning me with the notion that I'm watching something important and engaging in the profound cultural conversation, but I don't think that quality is actually separable from the approach of the engaging visuals. And at the end of the day, as much as the show flaunts its directorial flourishes and rebels against the notion of narrative importance, it is a TV show, and it is not experimental enough to reject narrative outright, so it still has to set up threads and bring them home within the confines of convention. And let me tell you, it is much better at the former than the latter. The second to last episode of Season 2 is the most recent time I questioned my entire stance on the show. What's not to love here? Tense cross-cutting, self-mythologizing, indulgent act breaks, everyone's put in the same room and we're gonna see how all these conflicts come to a head. It was also the first episode I watched with other people, so I could feel the communal high TV is so good at instilling, and for an hour there, it all clicked. But this was followed the next week by the show systematically going through each thread and bringing them all to the most underwhelming conclusions imaginable. I don't know if it's even worth it to go through each thread and point out where the show goes wrong. I'm certainly not going to give it the 13 Reasons Why treatment. But that's because Sam Levinson doesn't seem to have given any of this any thought in the first place, and he's so high on his own success, he doesn't have any lackeys to point out his inconsistencies anymore. People attribute a lot of the character work, namely Kat getting sidelined and Nate not sharing any scenes with Rue or Jules, except for one, on behind-the-scenes drama. But a good writer should be able to play the hand they're dealt, and even play into the setbacks, which Levinson doesn't really do. It is astonishing just how inconsistent the season is, though. The most representative example that comes to mind is spending all this time on Nate threatening Maddie with a gun to get the tapes back, and returning them to Jules, with Rue narrating his rationale for not sending Cal to jail.
While he didn't know much about real estate, he did know there wasn't much of a market for homes built by a pedophile.
And then 2 episodes later, he has Cal arrested with all the videos on a thumb drive. And the reason he gives is the recurring dream he has of Cal fucking him that we just saw once in the previous episode, which is treated as though it's been a season-long problem for Nate. Not only does this undermine the story beats we've been watching and facilitate a non-ending to the Cassie situation, which has arguably been given more focus this season than anything else, but it also undermines Rue's narration. Why have her narrate for the other characters if we're not getting the proper insight on them? It's not like having her as an unreliable narrator is a comment on her frayed relationship with everyone. I don't even think she's supposed to be an unreliable narrator for anyone besides herself. She's usually right. But more importantly, decisions like this feel like Levinson is just writing by free association. He has the memory of a goldfish. And when they're not straight up contradictions to what we've previously seen, they're character moments that either haven't been set up or just don't make any sense. Ashtray pulling a Slumdog Millionaire is as inexplicable as it was in Slumdog Millionaire. There's also the loose ends left unaddressed, like Rue being indebted to Lori. I've seen a lot of benefit of the doubt given to the show, like people assuming Rue's debts have been paid off by Lori sedating and trafficking her to the $10,000 threshold. But Rue clearly breaks out of the house, and Lori has been established as very anal about financial matters. And even if she didn't come back for the rest of the season, just an indicator that she's out there, or that the conflict is resolved, would do wonders. Literally, just one moment where Rue so much as thinks about what happened. That's all it needs. I'm not even gonna ask the show to attempt any cohesion between the plots. Rue and Jules are totally separate from everything else happening in the show, which could very easily be played into to demonstrate Rue alienating herself, and the show doesn't really do that. But whatever. Before we worry about more macro stuff like that, I just want Levinson to be able to resolve a single thread on its own first. If that stream of consciousness, in consideration for what he's already written, approach is how he's able to cook up the crazy moments that are Season 2's highs, then I don't want to take that from him. It even ironically feeds into my interests at times, like causing him to ditch the character backstory intro thing after trying to keep it up this season for like 3 episodes. But if he just had someone behind him cleaning up his wake and tying those loose ends together, It would be such an easy fix that would elevate the material tenfold. I refuse to buy into the notion of, oh, the messy narrative is in service of the messy world and the messy lives of these characters. That becomes a cop-out very quickly, and Levinson is miles past the threshold of cop-out here. And if he secretly does have lackeys polishing up his scripts and going uncredited, interns or something, then that's another story entirely. All this being said, though, I have to concede that Euphoria Season 2 is a success for Levinson and for HBO. That it's even a watchable final product feels like he crash-landed a plane, but in a game of sheer numbers, this fact is indisputable. Euphoria has become HBO's second most watched show ever. And it's more than just that. The stranglehold it has on the culture is something that's been missing from TV for a few years now. I know in my Succession video I gave a zeitgeist reason for Euphoria not being as big a show as Succession, but to my chagrin, I was dead wrong. Over the past 2 months, you could just tweet a character's name, even something generic like Lexi, and your tweet would light like wildfire. It would combust. It would catch the most contagious case of discourse fever we've ever seen. And the beauty of this, Levinson's actual talent here, is that because he seems to have invested nothing into storytelling, he's cast all his skill points into marketability and Twitter moments. And I know aiming for Twitter moments is a practice that's looked down upon, but I think there's something to be said for engaging with an audience on that level. Quote-unquote respectable art, as we've understood it, prioritizes its own purposes and has more separation from audience demands. This is of course the right move to avoid falling into the fan service trap and feeding viewers slop that won't challenge or push them in any way, but Euphoria weaponizes this audience relationship in a unique way. When it does something crazy and unearned, the stans tweet about how crazy it is and get 100,000 retweets, and the naysayers tweet about how unearned it is and get 100,000 retweets. Then the tweets generate more viewers, and the viewers generate more tweets, and the show becomes HBO's second most popular show ever after just 2 seasons, and more importantly, it takes the #1 spot in the public consciousness for both favorable and unfavorable reasons. The ability to achieve such provocation on both sides of the zeitgeist is genuinely admirable. You want a piece of art to speak for itself so as to stand the test of time, but Euphoria is almost a piece of performance art, so tuned into the moment and conversing with an active and temporally present audience that even if it doesn't hold up as a TV show, it's cementing itself historically as a cultural phenomenon that I think should be considered a significant achievement. For this reason, I think the meta thing they're doing with Lexi's play as a microcosm for the show actually works. There are moments of genuinely impressive direction and blocking, well-constructed individual scenes, but the narrative logistics of the show are impossible, and the whole thing is way too expensive and spectacle-heavy to capture the authentic high school experience it claims to strive for. We even get a line addressing the show's narrative chaos.
What act are we in?
Don't question it. That's the brilliance of Lexi Howard.
Higher.
Which I'm sure is a tongue-in-cheek line about Sam Levinson, but that one teeters a little too far over the line for my liking. The play is better enjoyed as a series of setups than payoffs, which is also why episode 207, part 1 of the play, is the more engaging episode. And like Euphoria itself, Lexi's play is most enjoyed not as a self-contained work, but because of the unique spectacle that occurs with its relationship to the audience. I think moving forward with the show, we can expect more of the same. Narrative bullshit and unearned character arcs with innovative setups and impressive editing techniques. I think to up the ante, it runs the risk of becoming a full-blown crime show in season 3, especially if we get a Cal prison arc and possibly bring Tyler back into the equation. But if that's the case, it could become a little trite. Part of what made season 2 the phenomenon it's been is the sheer whiplash of how overblown the crime stuff has gotten, and if audiences are consequently prepared for that, it could lose some of its provocative power. But it's Euphoria. Maybe Sam Levinson's third eye is 2 steps ahead of us all, and he'll find a new way to prod the culture. Until then, I feel like I've been personally served enough food to mull over for the next couple years and become ever more perplexed by where I actually stand on the show. What's undeniable is that I was waiting with bated breath for each new episode, and I'll be on my couch at 9 p.m. Sunday night, whenever in 2024 Season 3 actually comes out. As always, let me know what you thought of the season in the comments, hot takes and predictions, and whatever else you're chomping at the bit to get out. I'll be here, reading. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.